People often say love becomes stronger when challenged, but for James and Diep, love was beginning to feel like a battlefield, and the person standing on the opposite side was not a stranger nor an enemy. It was James' own father. The evening was quiet when James returned home to announce the news that had filled his heart with excitement. He wanted to marry Diep soon. But before the words could even settle in the room, his father's face darkened instantly. "Marry her? Now? Absolutely not!" His father shouted, his voice shaking the windows more than the wind outside. James froze. His mother looked up from the sofa, startled, knowing this was the moment she had feared. His father continued, pacing back and forth. "I will never agree. That girl has nothing, no education, no background, and now she's even taking in someone else's child. What kind of future do you think you will have?" James clenched his fists. He had prepared himself for resistance, but he didn't expect it to be so harsh. "Dad," he said firmly, "Diep is not what you think. She's hardworking, kind, and she's the person I love." "That's exactly the problem," his father snapped. "Love blinds you. You think with your heart, not your head. You're throwing your life away for a woman who can offer you nothing." His mother stepped in gently. "Stop yelling. They truly care for each other." But her words only fueled the fire. "Care? Caring doesn't run a company. Caring doesn't build a family. And I refuse to let my son destroy his future with his own hands." The house fell into a suffocating silence. James looked at his father, not with anger, but with a deep sadness. He knew his father wasn't trying to hurt him. He was trying to protect him in the only way he knew, with control. Diep, unaware of the chaos unfolding, was at home washing dishes after dinner. She hummed softly, imagining how happy James must be preparing for the wedding. She didn't know that at that exact moment, her name was being shouted like a crime. Back in the living room, James took a slow breath and finally said, "No matter what you say, I will marry Diep." His father slammed the table so hard the glasses rattled. "If you insist on this marriage, then don't expect my blessing or my support." The words felt like a blade cutting right through James' chest. His mother turned away, hiding her tears. For the first time in his life, James felt a line drawn between him and the man he respected the most. And for the first time, he realized that love, his love for Diep, was going to demand courage far more than he expected.
James had never felt pressure like this before. The weight of his father's disapproval followed him everywhere, into every meeting, every phone call, every quiet moment he tried to claim for himself. Yet none of it compared to the fear of losing Diep. The more people tried to pull them apart, the more fiercely he held on to her, as if she were the only real thing left in a world collapsing around him. Every evening after work, James drove to Diep's small countryside home. She would be in the backyard, washing vegetables or feeding the chickens, her long hair tied loosely behind her. The moment she saw him, her eyes softened like lanterns glowing against the dusk, and each time James felt his resolve harden even more. He would not let anything take her from him, not business enemies, not scandals, not his own father. But Diep could feel the storm gathering around them. Rumors had begun to spread in the village about the powerful CEO whose company was falling apart, about the girl from the countryside who was accused of trapping him, about the baby people whispered she might be carrying. Whenever Diep went to the market to sell vegetables, the gossip floated around her like a swarm of bees. Some women looked at her with pity, others with envy, and a few with open hostility. One afternoon, while she was arranging baskets of fresh eggplants, an older woman approached her and muttered, "Are you sure he'll still marry you when his father is against it?
Men from rich families rarely choose girls like you." Diep's hands tightened on the basket until her knuckles turned white. She wanted to speak, but her throat trembled too much for words. She simply bowed her head and continued working. That night, when James found her sitting silently on the wooden step outside her house, he knew something was wrong. Her eyes were red, even though she tried to hide it. Without asking, he sat beside her and pulled her into his arms. "Diep, I don't care what anyone says. I don't care who stands in the way. You're the woman I love, and I will marry you. Soon, very soon." For the first time that day, Diep allowed herself to breathe. The world was turning against them, but in that moment, wrapped in James's warmth, she knew they still had one thing left: a love strong enough to fight back. James decided it was time to confront the storm head-on. He returned home late one evening, determined to speak to his father again, this time not as a son begging for permission, but as a man fighting for the woman he loved. His father, Mr. Tron, sat in the living room reading financial reports, the tension in the room as sharp as broken glass. James stood before him, chest tight yet unshaken. "Father," he began calmly, "I'm marrying Diep, no matter what." The old man's jaw stiffened. He lowered the papers slowly, eyes narrowing with a mixture of anger and disbelief. "Have you completely lost your mind?" Mr. Tron snapped. "Your company is already unstable. Investors are withdrawing, rivals are circling like wolves, and you want to marry a village girl? Now?" "Especially now," James replied, "because Diep is the only person who stood by me when everything else fell apart." His father scoffed, slamming the papers onto the table. "She is manipulating you. You're blind, James, completely blinded by emotion." James clenched his fists. "No, I finally see clearly." The argument escalated, voices rising, the air thick with years of unspoken tension. When James finally walked out of the house, the door trembled from the force of his father's anger. He drove straight to Diep's home, the night air rushing through the open window, cooling the fire still burning in his chest. When he arrived, Diep was sweeping the yard under the dim light of a hanging bulb. She looked up, startled at his sudden appearance. "James, what happened?" Without answering, he took her hands, cold from the night breeze, and placed them over his heart. "Diep," he said, voice still trembling from the confrontation, "my father may never accept us. He may never bless our wedding, but I refuse to wait any longer. I want to marry you now, as soon as possible." Her breath caught, her eyes widened, reflecting both shock and fear. "James, your father will hate me. The whole world already thinks we're too different. I don't want you to lose everything because of me." James shook his head, pulling her into his arms. "Diep, listen to me. You are not the reason I'm losing anything. You are the reason I'm still standing." Her resistance melted, the weight of her worries softening against his chest. For a moment, the world outside disappeared. The gossip, the pressure, the business chaos, even Mr. Tron's fury. All that remained was the steady rhythm of their hearts beating in defiance. Under the quiet night sky, James whispered the words that sealed their fate. "We're getting married. No more waiting." And Diep, finally allowing herself to trust love over fear, nodded through trembling tears. "Then I'll marry you, James." Their decision was reckless, impossible, and against everything the world expected, but it was theirs, and nothing would stop them now. The news spread faster than wildfire. By the next morning, the entire village buzzed with whispers. James and Diep were getting married immediately. Some were delighted, some were shocked. Many doubted it would last. And far away in the city, when the news finally reached Mr. Tron, his reaction was explosive. He stormed into James's company, furious enough to shake the building's walls. "Are you out of your mind?" he roared as he burst into James's office. "I will not allow this wedding." James stood firm behind his desk, calm but unyielding. "It's not your decision anymore, Father." Mr. Tron pointed a trembling finger at him. "Do you even understand what you're doing? Your reputation will suffer. Investors will laugh at you. Your business is hanging by a thread, and instead of saving it, you run off to marry a farmer girl?" James's jaw tightened. "Her name is Diep, and she is worth more than every investor combined." His father's face paled with disbelief, almost as if his own son had become a stranger. "If you walk this path, don't expect my help ever again." James swallowed hard. The words hurt, more than he cared to admit, but he refused to bend. "I'm not marrying for money. I'm marrying for love." His father turned away, fists clenched. "Then you'll have to bear the consequences alone." He left without looking back. That evening, James returned to the village with a quiet heaviness in his heart. Diep was sewing small white flowers onto the simple wedding dress her aunt had helped her prepare. When she saw James at the door, she immediately sensed something was wrong. "Did your father—" "Yes," James said softly. "He has cut all support. Financially, personally, everything." Diep froze, the piece of thread slipping from her fingers. "James, maybe we should wait. I don't want to be the reason you lose your family." He knelt beside her, taking her trembling hands into his. "You didn't take anything from me. You gave me something I've never had. A home in someone's heart." Her eyes filled with tears. "And a future. One I'd choose with you." Diep broke down, resting her forehead against his. The room felt small and warm, lit only by an old lantern, but in that moment, it felt like the safest place in the world. Outside, the wind stirred the banana leaves, carrying the murmurs of the village. Inside, two determined souls vowed silently to stand against every storm, together. Their wedding would be small, simple, fragile in the eyes of society, but to them, it would be the bravest beginning of their lives. And no objection, not even a father's thunderous fury, could stop the love they had chosen.